A Pair of Schoolgirls by Angela Brazil. Chapter 2. What Dorothy Overheard. At 3:30, exactly in the middle of the French reading lesson, Miss James, the school secretary, entered the upper fourth room with a sheaf of voting papers in her hand. These were dealt round to all the girls, with the exception of the candidates, and Miss James gave a brief explanation of what was required. On each paper you will find 6 names. You must put a cross to the one you wish to choose for your warden. Do not write anything at all, but fold the paper and hand it in to Miss Pitman, who will place it in this box, which I shall call for in 5 minutes. So saying, she bustled away in a great hurry to perform a similar errand in the next classroom. The 6 candidates tried to sit looking disinterested and unconscious while their fates were being decided. Hope Lawson hunted out words in the dictionary. Valentine Barnett made a parade of arranging the contents of her pencil box, and the others opened books and began preparation. Not a word was allowed to be spoken. In dead silence the girls recorded their crosses and handed in their papers, and the last was hardly dropped into the ballot box before Miss James reappeared. The result of the election was to be announced at 4 o'clock, therefore there were still 20 minutes of suspense. Miss Pitman went on with the French reading as if nothing had happened, and Dorothy made a gallant effort to fix her attention on Le Jeune Patriote, and to forget that Miss Tempest and Miss James were hard at work in the library counting votes. Nobody's translation was particularly brilliant that afternoon. Everyone was watching the clock and longing for the end of the lesson. When the bell rang there was a general scuffle, books were seized and desk lids banged, and though Miss Pitman called the form to order and insisted upon a decorous exit from the room, the girls simply pelted down the stairs to the lecture hall. In a few moments the whole school had assembled. There was not long to wait, for exactly at the stroke of 4 Miss Tempest walked onto the platform and made the brief announcement. Hope Lawson has been elected warden of the lower school by a majority of 50 votes. Dorothy left the lecture hall with her head in a whirl. That Hope should have won by such an enormous majority was most astonishing. She could not understand it. Conversation was strictly forbidden on the staircase, but the moment she reached the gymnasium she burst into eager inquiries. "Yes, it's a surprise to everybody," said Ruth Harmon. "I thought myself that Val would get it. All the lower fourth and most of the upper third were for her. Then how could Hope possibly score by 50? She did it with the kids, I suppose. But the first and second weren't voting?" "Indeed they were." "Do you mean to say you never knew?" "Why, Miss James gave it out this morning." "Of all cells," gasped Dorothy. "I heard nothing about it. It's the first year those kids have ever taken part in the election. Why couldn't some of you tell me? I was just going to said Mavi, but you stalked away and wouldn't listen. It's your own fault, Dorothy. You might have run after me. You looked so lofty, I didn't feel disposed." "Val didn't know either," interposed Bertha Warren. "She never canvassed in the first or the second, no more did Grace or Noel. I'm not certain if any of you knew except Hope. Only a few were in the room when Miss James gave it out." "Then she's taken a most mean advantage," said Dorothy. I understand now why she was sitting on the seesaw making herself so extremely pleasant. It's not fair. Miss James ought to have announced to the whole school that such a change had been made. Go and tell her so, sneered Phyllis Fowler. Those who lose always call things unfair, added Joyce Hickson. Dorothy walked away without another word. She did not wish to be considered jealous, and her common sense told her that she had already said more than enough. She was too proud to ask for sympathy, and felt that her most dignified course was to accept her defeat in silence. She thought she would rather not speak even to her friends, so, ignoring violent signals from Bertha Warren and Addie Parker, she went at once to put on her outdoor clothes. The dressing room, to provide greater accommodation, had not only hooks round the walls, but double rows of hat stands down the middle, with lockers for boots underneath. As Dorothy sat changing her shoes, she could hear 3 girls talking on the other side of the hat stand, though, owing to the number of coats which were hanging up, the speakers were hidden from her. She recognized their voices, however, perfectly well. "I'm rather surprised at Hope getting it," Helen Walker was saying. "I thought Val was pretty safe." "I voted for her, of course." "A good many voted for Dorothy," replied Evie Fenwick. "I know. I thought she might have had a chance even against Val. She'll be dreadfully disgusted." "I'm very glad Hope was chosen," said Agnes Lowe. "After all, she's far the most suitable for warden. She's ever so much cleverer than Val." "But not more than Dorothy." "No, but she's a girl of better position, and that counts for something. Her father was mayor last year, and her mother is quite an authority on education, and speaks at meetings." "Well, Dorothy's aunt writes articles for magazines. One often sees the name Barbara Sherborne in the newspapers. Dorothy's tremendously proud of her." "Dorothy needn't take any credit to herself on that account," returned Agnes, "for, as it happens, Miss Sherborne isn't her aunt at all. She's no relation." "Are you sure?" "Absolutely. I know for a fact that Dorothy is nothing but a waif, a nobody, who is being brought up for charity. Miss Sherborne adopted her when she was a baby." At this most astounding piece of information, Dorothy, who had followed the conversation without any thought of eavesdropping, flung her slippers into her locker and stalked round to the other side of the hat stand. "Agnes Lowe, what do you mean by telling such an absolute story?" she asked grimly. "I'd no idea you were there," returned Agnes. "Listeners never hear any good of themselves," laughed Helen. "I'm extremely glad I overheard. It gives me a chance to deny such rubbish. I shall expect Agnes to make an instant apology." Dorothy's tone was aggressive. She waited with a glare in her eyes and a determined look about her mouth. Agnes did not flinch, however. "I'm sorry you heard what I said, Dorothy," she replied. "It wasn't meant for you, but it's true, all the same, and I can't take back my words." "How can it be true?" Agnes put on her hat hastily and seized her satchel. "You'd better ask Miss Sherborne. Probably everyone in Hereford knows about it except yourself. Come, Helen, I'm ready now," and she hurried away with her 2 friends, evidently anxious to escape further questioning. Dorothy took up her pile of home lesson books and followed them, but they must have raced down the passage, for when she reached the door they were already disappearing round the corner of the playground. It was useless to think of pursuing them, she had barely time, as it was, to catch her train, and she must walk fast if she meant to be at the station by 4:30. She scurried along High Street, keeping a watchful eye on the town hall clock in the intervals of dodging passengers on the pavements and dashing recklessly over crossings. At Station Road she quickened her footsteps to a run, and tore up the flight of stairs that was the shortest cut to the ticket office. Fortunately she possessed a contract, so she had no further delay, and was able to scuttle across the platform into the Hereford train. The guard, who knew her well by sight, smiled as he slammed the door of her compartment. "A near shave today, missy. I see you're back at school," he remarked, then waved his green flag. Dorothy sank down breathlessly. To miss the 4.30 would have meant waiting 3/4 of an hour, a tiresome experience which she had gone through before, and had no desire to repeat. She was lucky, certainly, but now that the anxiety of catching the train was over, the reaction came, and she felt both tired and cross. What an enormously long time it seemed since she had started that morning, and what a horrid day it had been. She leaned back in a corner of the compartment and took a mental review of everything that had happened at school, her expectation of winning the election, her canvassing among the girls, their many ill-natured remarks, Val's method of bribery, and Hope's unfair advantage. She was bitterly chagrined at missing the wardenship, and the thought that she might have had a chance of success if she had known of the voting powers of the first and second forms only added to her disappointment. She was indignant and out of temper with Mavi, with Hope, with the whole of her little world. Everything had seemed to go wrong, and, to crown all, Agnes Lowe had dared to call her a nobody and a charity child. What could Agnes mean? It was surely a ridiculously false accusation, made from spite or sheer love of teasing. She, Dorothy Greenfield, a waif. The idea was impossible. Why, she had always prided herself upon her good birth. The Sherbornes were of knightly race, and their doings were mentioned in the county history of Devonshire as far back as Queen Elizabeth's reign. Of course, her name was Greenfield, not Sherborne, but she was of the same lineage, and she had pasted the family crest inside her school books. She would trace out her pedigree that very evening right to Sir Thomas Sherborne, who helped to fit out a ship to fight the Armada, and she would take a copy to school tomorrow and show it to Agnes, who could not fail to be convinced by such positive evidence. Yes, the girls should see that, far from being a nobody, she was really of a better family than Hope Lawson, whose claims to position rested solely on her father's public services to the city of Coalminster. And yet under all her assurance there lurked an uneasy sensation of doubt. She had taken it for granted that her mother was a Sherborne, but she remembered now that when she had spoken of her as such, Aunt Barbara had always evaded the subject. Nobody ever mentioned her parents. She had thought it was because they were dead, but surely that was not a sufficient reason for the omission. Could there be another and a stronger motive for thus withholding all knowledge about them? Several things occurred to her, hints that had been dropped by Martha, the maid, which, though not comprehended, had remained in her memory, looks, glances, half-spoken sentences let fall by Aunt Barbara's friends, 100 nothings too small in themselves to be noticed, but, counted in the aggregate, quite sufficient to strengthen the unwelcome suspicion that had suddenly awakened. Rubbish, thought Dorothy, with an effort to dispel the black shadow. I'll ask Aunt Barbara, and I've no doubt she'll easily explain it all and set everything right. By this time the train had passed Ash Hill, Burnley, and Letchworth, and had arrived at Hereford, Dorothy's station. She stepped out of the compartment, so preoccupied with her reflections that she would have forgotten her books, if a fellow passenger had not handed them to her. She scarcely noticed the rector and his children, who were standing on the platform, and, turning a deaf ear to the youngest boy, who called to her to wait for them, she hurried off alone along the road. It was a pleasant walk to her home, between green hedges, and with a view of woods and distant hills. Hereford was quite a country place, and could boast of thatched cottages, a market cross, and a pair of stocks, although it lay barely 12 miles from the great manufacturing city of Coalminster. Dorothy's destination was a little, quaint, old-fashioned stone house that stood close by the roadside at the beginning of the village street. A well-clipped holly hedge protected from prying eyes a garden where summer flowers were still blooming profusely, a strip of lawn was laid out for croquet, and a small orchard, at the back, held a moderate crop of pears and apples. Dorothy ran in through the creeper-covered porch, slammed her books on the hall table, then, descending 2 steps, entered the low-ceiled, oak-panelled dining room, and rushed to fling her arms round a lady who was sitting doing fancy work near the open window. "Here I am at last, Auntie. Oh, I feel as if I hadn't seen you for 100 years. I'm in the upper 4th, but it's been a hateful day. I never thought school was so horrid before. I'm very disappointed and disgusted and abominably cross." "Poor little woman. What's the matter?" said Aunt Barbara, taking Dorothy's face in her hands, as the girl knelt by her side, and trying to kiss away the frown that rested there. "You certainly don't look as if you had been enjoying yourself." "Enjoying myself? I should think not. We had an election for the wardenship, and my name was on the list, and I might perhaps have won if the others hadn't been so mean, but I didn't, and Hope Lawson has got it. We can't always win, can we? Never mind. It's something that your name was on the list of candidates. All the girls who lost will be feeling equally disappointed. Suppose you just forget about it, go and take off your things, and tell Martha to make some buttered toast." Dorothy laughed. Already her face had lost its injured and woeful expression. "That's as good as saying, don't make a fuss about nothing." "All right, Auntie, I'm oil. But I warn you that this is only a respite, and I mean to give you a full and detailed list of all my particular grievances after tea. So make up your mind to it, and brace your dear nerves." Miss Barbara Sherborne was a most charming personality. She was young enough to be still very pretty and attractive, but old enough to take broad views of life, and to have attained that independence of action which is the prerogative of middle age. She was a clever and essentially a cultured woman. She had lived abroad in her youth, and the glamour of old Italian cities and soft, southern skies still seemed to cling to her. She was a good amateur musician, could sketch a little, and had lately obtained some success in writing. Ever since Dorothy could remember, she and Aunt Barbara and Martha, the maid, had lived together at Holly Cottage, a particularly harmonious trio, liking their own mode of life, and quite independent of the outside world. The little house seemed to fit its inmates, and, in spite of its small accommodation, to provide just what was wanted for each. First there was the old-fashioned dining room, with its carved oak furniture, blue china, and rows of shining pewter, its choice prints on the walls, its bookshelves, overflowing with interesting volumes, and the desk where Aunt Barbara wrote in the mornings, a room that seemed made especially for comfort, and reached its acme of coziness on a cold winter's day, when armchairs were drawn up to the blazing fire that burnt in the quaint dog grate. Then there was the little drawing-room, with its piano and music rack, and its great Japanese cabinet, full of all kinds of treasures from foreign places. When Dorothy was a tiny girl, it had been her Sunday afternoon treat to be allowed to investigate the mysteries of this cabinet, to open its numerous drawers and sliding panels, and to turn over the miscellaneous collection of things it contained, and she still regarded it in the light of an old friend. The artistic decorations, the chintz hangings, the watercolor paintings of Italian scenes, all helped to give an aesthetic effect to the room, and to make a very pleasant whole. The kitchen was, of course, Martha's particular domain, but even here there were books and pictures, and a table reserved for writing desk and work basket. I fear Martha did not often busy herself with pens and paper, for she held head learning in good-natured contempt, but she appreciated her mistress's effort to make her comfortable, and polished the brass-topped inkpot diligently, if she seldom used it. Peterkin, the grey Persian cat, generally sat in the armchair, or on Martha's knee, which he much preferred, when he got the chance, and Draco, the green parrot, hobbled up and down his perch at the sunny window, repeating his stock of phrases, begging for titbits, or imitating smacking kisses. Just at the top of the stairs was Dorothy's special sanctum. It had formerly been her nursery, and still contained her old doll's house, put away in a corner, though her toys were now replaced by schoolgirl possessions. Here she kept her tennis racket, her hockey stick, her camera and photographic materials, her collections of stamps, crests, and picture postcards. There was a table where she could use paste or glue, or indulge in various sticky performances forbidden in the dining room, and a cupboard where oddments could be stored without the painful necessity of continually keeping them tidily arranged. She could try experiments in sweet making, clay modeling, bookbinding, or any of the other arts and crafts that were represented at the annual school exhibition. In fact, it was a dear, delightful den, where she could conduct operations without being obliged to move her things away, and might make a mess in defiance of Martha's chidings. Dorothy often took a peep into her sanctum on her return from Avondale, but today she ran straight to her bedroom. She was anxious to finish tea and have a talk with Aunt Barbara. She felt she could not rest until she had mentioned Agnes Lowe's remarks, and either proved or disproved their truth. It was not a question that she could raise, however, when Martha was coming into and going out of the dining room with hot water and toast, and it was only after she had cajoled Miss Sherborne to the privacy of the summer house, and had related her other school woes, that the girl ventured to broach the subject. "I know it's nonsense, Auntie, but I thought I'd like to tell you, all the same," she concluded, and waited for a denial with a look of anxiety in her eyes that belied her words. Miss Sherborne did not at once reply. Apparently she was considering what answer to make. "I knew you would ask me this some day, Dorothy," she said at last. "It seemed unnecessary for you to know before, but you are growing older so fast that it is time you learned your own story." Dorothy turned her face sharply away. She did not want even Aunt Barbara to see how her mouth was quivering. "Is it true, then?" she asked, in a strangled voice. "Yes, dear child. In a sense it is all absolutely true.